The deafening crack of a bullwhip echoed through the modest Wyoming cabin as Ruby Matthews pressed herself against the rough-hewn wall, her eyes wide with terror but no sound escaping her trembling lips. It had been 3 years since she'd spoken a single word. 3 years of enduring the brutal reign of Floyd Blackwell, a man who'd promised her father on his deathbed that he would care for his only daughter. The year was 1873, and at 22 years old, Ruby had learned that silence was her only defense. Her once vibrant voice had retreated deep within her, buried beneath layers of fear and survival instinct. She flinched as Floyd's footsteps thundered across the wooden floor, his shadow looming larger than life in the flickering lamplight. "Think you can hide from me, girl?" he snarled, alcohol heavy on his breath. "Your pa might have thought you were something special, but he ain't here to see what a burden you've become." Ruby kept her gaze lowered, her hands reflexively tracing the scars that marked her arms, permanent reminders of Floyd's discipline whenever she tried to speak her mind in those early days. Her auburn hair hung limply around her face, partially obscuring the yellowing bruise on her cheekbone. Floyd grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Got nothing to say, as usual?" He laughed cruelly. "Good. That's how I prefer you." As dawn broke the following morning, Ruby moved silently through her chores, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs while Floyd slept off his night of drinking. The crisp autumn air bit at her skin through her threadbare dress, but she barely noticed the cold anymore. Physical discomforts paled in comparison to the prison her life had become. Her fingers worked methodically as she swept the porch, her mind drifting to the letters her father had written her before his passing, letters full of hope and promise that she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her small room. They were all that remained of the man who had raised her with kindness and laughter before consumption had claimed him, leaving her at the mercy of his trusted friend. The distant sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare at the isolated Blackwell homestead, and rarely brought anything but trouble. Ruby's heart quickened as she watched a lone rider approaching on a magnificent chestnut stallion. The stranger sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders capped with a well-worn leather duster, a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Ruby quickly finished her sweeping and turned to hurry inside before Floyd could wake and find her interacting with anyone. But she wasn't fast enough. "Mornin', miss?" called a deep, resonant voice that stopped her in her tracks. Something in his tone, a gentleness she hadn't heard directed at her in years, made her pause at the doorway. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat to reveal sun-bronzed features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Vaughn Calloway. I'm looking for Floyd Blackwell. Would he be around?" Ruby stood frozen, her eyes darting toward the cabin door, uncertain how to respond without words. Her fingers twisted anxiously in her apron as she struggled with the dilemma. Vaughn studied her with a perceptive gaze that seemed to take in everything: the faded bruise on her face, her nervous demeanor, the way she unconsciously retreated a step when he approached. "It's all right," he said more softly, staying where he was. "I don't mean to frighten you, miss. I'm just passing through, looking to collect on a debt owed to my employer." The cabin door slammed open, making Ruby flinch visibly. Floyd emerged, his unshaven face contorted with irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, squinting against the morning light. Vaughn replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. "Vaughn Calloway, representing the Western Union Bank in Cheyenne. You're 3 months behind on your loan payments, Mr. Blackwell." Floyd spat on the ground. "Bank can wait. Crops failed this year. I'm afraid they've been patient enough. I've been authorized to offer you one last chance to make good before foreclosure proceedings begin." Ruby watched the exchange with widening eyes. Foreclosure would mean what? Where would she go? As terrible as life with Floyd was, the unknown terrified her equally. Floyd's gaze shifted to Ruby, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Get inside and fix some coffee," he barked. Now. She hurried to obey, but not before catching Vaughn Calloway's thoughtful expression as he watched her disappear into the cabin. Once inside, she moved mechanically through the familiar motions of preparing coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she stoked the stove fire. Through the window, she could see the two men engaged in tense conversation. Floyd's posture was aggressive, his hands gesticulating wildly, while Vaughn maintained a calm, steady stance. There was something different about this stranger, a quiet strength that seemed at odds with the harsh world around them. When she brought the coffee outside, Floyd snatched the cup from her hands without acknowledgement. Vaughn, however, inclined his head in thanks when she offered him the second cup, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "The girl," Floyd was saying, "she works the place with me. Mute as a post, though. Hasn't spoken a word in years." He said it dismissively, as though discussing a defective farm animal. Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame washing over her even though she knew her silence wasn't a choice but a necessity, a shield she'd built around herself to survive. "That right," Vaughn replied, his tone neutral as he sipped his coffee. But there was something in his gaze when it returned to Ruby, a flash of understanding that made her heart beat faster. "I'll need to inspect the property," Vaughn continued, addressing Floyd but occasionally glancing at Ruby. "Bank wants a full accounting of assets before making any decisions about extending the loan terms." Floyd cursed but eventually agreed, clearly seeing no alternative. "Fine. We'll start with the barn. Girl, get back to your chores." As the men walked toward the barn, Ruby returned to her tasks, her mind racing. Something was shifting in the stagnant air of her existence. She could feel it. Whether it meant better or worse days ahead, she couldn't say, but the stranger's arrival had cracked open a door she'd thought permanently sealed. Throughout the day, Ruby caught glimpses of Vaughn as he methodically evaluated the property. Unlike Floyd, who moved with volatile, unpredictable energy, Vaughn's movements were measured and deliberate. She noticed how he took the time to stroke the nose of their old plow horse, the gentleness with which he handled the farm equipment, the respect he showed even to inanimate objects. By late afternoon, Floyd's patience had worn thin. "You've seen it all now," he growled at Vaughn. "What's the verdict?" Standing in the yard, Vaughn removed his hat again, running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "The land has potential, but it's been neglected. The bank will want improvements before considering an extension." Floyd swore colorfully. "Improvements cost money I don't have." "Then I suggest you find it," Vaughn replied evenly. "You have 2 weeks." Ruby, hanging laundry nearby, accidentally dropped a sheet at Floyd's resulting outburst. As she bent to retrieve it, she sensed Floyd advancing toward her, his anger seeking a convenient target. "Useless girl," he shouted, reaching for her arm. "Can't even do simple chores right." But before his fingers could close around her wrist, Vaughn stepped between them, his movement so swift and subtle that it appeared almost casual. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, his voice maintaining its calm tenor despite the tension crackling in the air. "Perhaps you'd be kind enough to show me your ledgers? The bank will want documentation of your income prospects." Floyd hesitated, his anger momentarily redirected. With a final glare at Ruby, he stomped toward the cabin. "Come on, then." As Vaughn followed, he paused briefly beside Ruby. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked quietly. Ruby couldn't meet his eyes, but she managed a small nod, clutching the damp sheet against her chest like a shield. "I'll be staying in the area for a few days," he continued, his voice low enough that Floyd couldn't hear from where he waited impatiently at the cabin door. "At the Miller place down the road." With that cryptic information, he followed Floyd inside, leaving Ruby staring after him, a strange fluttering sensation in her chest that she couldn't quite name. That night, Floyd drank more heavily than usual, railing against banks, debt collectors, and the unfairness of life. Ruby kept to the shadows, making herself as invisible as possible as she cleared away the dinner dishes. When Floyd finally passed out in his chair, she crept to her small room, securing the door with the wooden wedge she'd carved years ago, not sturdy enough to keep him out if he was determined, but enough to warn her if he tried to enter. In the safety of darkness, Ruby withdrew her father's letters from their hiding place, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. Jonathan Matthews had been a dreamer, a man who believed in the promise of the West despite its hardships. In his final letter, he'd expressed hope that Floyd would be a good guardian to her, that she would be safe. A bitter smile crossed her lips at the cruel irony. How little her father had known the true nature of his friend. As she carefully returned the letters to their hiding place, Ruby caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin. The woman staring back at her was a stranger hollow-cheeked, with eyes too old for her young face. When had she disappeared so completely? For the first time in years, Ruby found herself wondering. If she tried to speak now, would any sound emerge? Or had her voice atrophied from disuse, like a limb bound too long? She opened her mouth, forming words with silent lips. "Help me!" No sound came, just the whisper of breath. The realization brought tears to her eyes. Even if she wanted to cry out, to tell someone of her plight, she wasn't sure she could anymore. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the drudgery of another day. Floyd was unusually subdued, nursing both a hangover and the worry of impending foreclosure. He barely acknowledged Ruby as she prepared breakfast, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Going to town," he announced abruptly, pushing away from the table. "Need to talk to some people about this bank business." Relief flooded through Ruby at the prospect of hours alone. Floyd rarely left her unsupervised, fearing she might flee, though where she would go, she had no idea. The outside world had become as frightening as her prison. "Don't get any ideas," Floyd warned, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll be back before sundown." The moment his wagon disappeared down the rutted dirt road, Ruby allowed herself a deep breath. The empty house seemed to expand around her, offering a temporary respite from constant vigilance. She worked through her chores with unusual vigor, savoring the silence that for once felt peaceful rather than oppressive. By midday, she had completed tasks that would normally take her until evening. On impulse, she decided to visit the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, a spot she'd once loved but rarely found time to visit anymore. The October sun cast dappled shadows through the cottonwoods as Ruby picked her way along the creek bank. She removed her worn boots and rolled up her skirts to wade into the cool water, feeling momentarily childlike as the current swirled around her ankles. Lost in this rare moment of peace, she didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until they were quite close. Her head snapped up, heart pounding with sudden fear. Had Floyd returned early? But it was Vaughn Calloway who appeared through the trees, leading his chestnut stallion by the reins. He stopped short when he saw her, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Matthews," he said, tipping his hat. "I didn't mean to startle you." Ruby hurriedly stepped out of the creek, smoothing down her skirts with damp hands, mortified to be caught in such an undignified position. "I was checking some boundary markers," he explained, keeping a respectful distance. "This creek forms the property line between Blackwell's land and the Millers." Ruby nodded, hastily putting on her boots, her eyes downcast. "Is Mr. Blackwell at the house?" Vaughn asked, glancing in that direction. She shook her head, then bit her lip, suddenly afraid he would think she was lying. "I see." Vaughn seemed to consider something before continuing. "Would you walk with me a ways? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Ruby hesitated, alarm bells ringing in her mind. Men who wanted to discuss things with her alone never had good intentions. Seeing her wariness, Vaughn added gently, "We'll stay right here by the creek in the open. You can leave any time you wish." Against her better judgment, Ruby found herself nodding. There was something about Vaughn Calloway that didn't fit with the other men. She'd known something in his eyes that spoke of honor rather than threat. They walked slowly along the creek bank, the horse trailing behind them. For several minutes, Vaughn didn't speak, seeming content with the companionable silence. Ruby stole glances at his profile, noting the straight nose, the firm jaw dusted with stubble, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Finally, he stopped in a small clearing where a fallen log provided a natural bench. "Would you care to sit?" he asked, gesturing to the log. Ruby perched tentatively on the edge, her posture rigid with uncertainty. Vaughn remained standing, maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Matthews, I want to be direct with you. I don't believe you're mute by birth or illness." Her eyes widened in alarm. How could he know? "I've seen this before," he continued quietly. "During the war, some soldiers stopped speaking after witnessing terrible things. Doctors called it shell shock. The mind protecting itself the only way it knows how." Ruby stared at her hands, twisting in her lap. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. "Floyd Blackwell is not a good man," Vaughn said, his tone hardening slightly. "And I suspect he's not been good to you." When she couldn't respond, he continued, "I didn't come here just for the bank. I've been tracking Blackwell for some time. 5 years ago, he was involved in a stagecoach robbery near Laramie. 3 people died, including my younger brother." Ruby's head snapped up, shock evident in her expression. "The law never caught him, but I've been following his trail since then. Took a job with the bank to help me track men like him who suddenly show up with money, buy land, then let it go to ruin." Vaughn's eyes held a sorrow that resonated with something deep inside Ruby. "I need to know, Miss Matthews, are you staying with him by choice?" The question hung in the air between them, momentous in its simplicity. Was she staying by choice? Had there ever been a choice? Slowly, deliberately, Ruby shook her head. Vaughn's expression softened. "I thought as much. Listen carefully. I plan to bring Blackwell to justice, but I need to do it legally. Evidence, witnesses. I don't want him walking free on some technicality." He took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it. "When I do move against him, things could get dangerous. I'd like to get you somewhere safe first." Ruby's breath caught. Leave? The possibility seemed simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Where would she go? How would she survive? And yet, the thought of freedom, true freedom, made her dizzy with longing. "There's a women's aid society in Cheyenne," Vaughn explained, "run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson. Good woman. Helps those who've suffered at the hands of men like Blackwell. She could give you shelter, maybe even work until you decide what you want to do." The offer hung between them, a lifeline Ruby wasn't sure she had the courage to grasp. Part of her wanted to flee immediately, to leave behind the nightmare her life had become. But another part, the part that had been systematically broken down over years of abuse, whispered that she wouldn't survive in the outside world, that Floyd would find her, that she deserved no better than what she had. As if sensing her internal struggle, Vaughn said softly, "You don't have to decide now. I'll be at the Miller place for 3 more days. If you choose to leave, come there. Anytime, day or night." The sound of distant wagon wheels made Ruby start to her feet, panic flooding her system. Floyd was returning early. "Go," Vaughn urged. "I'll head the other direction. He won't know we've spoken." Ruby gathered her skirts and turned to hurry back to the cabin, but Vaughn's voice stopped her one last time. "Miss Matthews," he called softly. When she looked back, his eyes held hers with steady conviction. You're safe with me. I give you my word. Something broke loose inside Ruby's chest at those simple words, a shard of ice that had been lodged in her heart for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She couldn't speak, couldn't even nod, but for just a moment, she held his gaze without flinching before turning to flee along the path toward the cabin. She arrived breathless, barely managing to compose herself before Floyd's wagon rattled into the yard. One look at his face told her his trip to town had not gone well. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. "Worthless town," he muttered as he stormed into the cabin. "Worthless people. Not a soul willing to help a man in need." Ruby moved silently around the kitchen, preparing a late lunch and hoping to avoid his attention. But Floyd seemed determined to vent his frustrations. "That bank man," he growled, pounding his fist on the table. "Acting all high and mighty. Who does he think he is? Been asking questions all over town about me, has he? Well, I've got questions of my own." Ruby froze, a plate half extended toward the table. Had Vaughn been indiscreet? Had someone in town mentioned his inquiries to Floyd? "I'll show him," Floyd continued, more to himself than to Ruby. "Nobody threatens Floyd Blackwell. Nobody." The menace in his voice sent a chill down Ruby's spine. Whatever Floyd was planning, it boded ill for Vaughn. She set down the plate with trembling hands, her mind racing. Should she warn him? Could she? As evening fell, Floyd's dark mood deepened. He cleaned his revolver at the table, methodically checking each chamber before loading it with fresh cartridges. Ruby watched from the corner of her eye as she washed the dishes, dread pooling in her stomach. "Going out," Floyd announced abruptly, tucking the weapon into his belt. "Don't wait up." The moment the door closed behind him, Ruby abandoned her task and rushed to the window. Through the gathering darkness, she watched Floyd saddle his horse and ride off, not toward town, but in the direction of the Miller homestead. Panic seized her. Floyd was going after Vaughn, perhaps to threaten him, perhaps worse. And it was her fault somehow. Floyd must have suspected their meeting by the creek. Without conscious decision, Ruby found herself grabbing her shawl and slipping out the back door. The Miller place was 3 miles away, a long walk, but she could cut across the fields and maybe, just maybe, arrive in time to warn Vaughn. The October night was cold, the quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate by. Ruby's heart pounded as she hurried through the tall grass, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. Every shadow seemed threatening, every rustle in the darkness a potential danger. She had never ventured out alone at night before, and the vastness of the starlit prairie both terrified and exhilarated her. Her progress seemed agonizingly slow. Floyd on horseback would reach the Miller homestead in a fraction of the time it would take her on foot. What if she arrived too late? What if she found Vaughn already? No, she wouldn't allow herself to complete that thought. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, pushing herself forward despite the stitch developing in her side. After what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, Ruby spotted the warm glow of lamps from the Miller homestead. The modest farmhouse sat nestled against a small rise, a barn and corral adjacent to it. Floyd's horse was nowhere in sight. Had she somehow beaten him here? Or had he taken another route? Ruby approached cautiously, uncertain how to proceed. What if the Millers saw her first? How would she explain her presence? A movement near the barn caught her attention. A tall figure emerged, leading a horse, Vaughn's distinctive chestnut stallion. Ruby's heart leapt. He was alive and apparently preparing to ride out. She hurried forward, waving her arms to catch his attention. Vaughn spotted her and froze, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. "Miss Matthews?" he called softly, tying his horse to a hitching post and striding toward her. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong?" Ruby nodded frantically, gesturing back in the direction she'd come from. How could she make him understand? Frustration welled up inside her as she pantomimed someone riding, then pointed to his chest and drew her finger across her throat in the universal sign for danger. Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes. Blackwell? He's coming for me? She nodded again, relief washing over her as he grasped her warning. When did he leave? How long ago? Ruby held up her fingers. 1, then 2. She wasn't sure if he would understand she meant between 1 and 2 hours. Vaughn's expression grew grim. If he left that long ago, he should have arrived by now. Unless... His eyes widened. Unless he's setting an ambush on the road to town. That's where I was headed. As if to confirm his suspicion, the distant sound of a horse's whinny carried through the night air. Vaughn reacted instantly, taking Ruby's arm and guiding her toward the barn. We need to get inside, he said urgently. Mrs. Miller and her daughter are visiting relatives, and Mr. Miller is in town until tomorrow. We're alone here. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Vaughn led Ruby to a ladder that accessed the hayloft. Up there, he directed. You'll be safer off the ground. Ruby climbed quickly, settling into the sweet-smelling hay as Vaughn followed, pulling the ladder up behind them. Through gaps in the barn wall, they could see the yard bathed in moonlight. For several long minutes, they waited in tense silence. Thank you, Vaughn whispered eventually. You risked a great deal to warn me. Ruby wished desperately that she could respond, could explain the guilt she felt at potentially putting him in danger. Instead, she could only meet his gaze in the dim light filtering through the barn wall. I didn't expect, Vaughn began, but stopped abruptly at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both froze, watching through the cracks as Floyd rode slowly into the yard, rifle balanced across his saddle. He dismounted with deliberate care, tying his horse beside Vaughn's. Calloway, he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. I know you're here. Your horse gives you away. Come out and face me like a man. Vaughn moved silently to Ruby's side. Stay here, he breathed against her ear. No matter what happens, don't come down until you're absolutely sure it's safe. Before she could react, he was moving toward the edge of the loft, preparing to climb down. Ruby grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear and protest. I have to end this, he told her softly. For my brother, for you, for anyone else he might hurt. With gentle firmness, he removed her hand from his arm and lowered himself over the edge of the loft, dropping silently to the barn floor below. Ruby crept to the edge, peering down anxiously as Vaughn drew his revolver and moved toward the barn door. Blackwell, he called out as he emerged into the moonlight. I'm here. What do you want? Floyd spun around, rifle raised. I want you off my back, bank man. I want you to forget whatever you think you know about me. Can't do that, Vaughn replied evenly, his revolver held low at his side. You've hurt too many people, Blackwell. It ends tonight. Floyd's laugh was ugly. Big talk from a dead man. Did you think I wouldn't recognize the name Calloway? Your brother squealed like a pig before he died. From her vantage point, Ruby could see Vaughn tense, but his voice remained steady. Put down the rifle, Floyd. There's a circuit judge arriving in Cheyenne next week. You'll get a fair trial. I'm not going to any trial, Floyd snarled. But I'll send you to meet your brother. Everything happened with terrifying speed. Floyd raised his rifle just as Vaughn dove to the side, firing his revolver. The shots echoed through the night, momentarily deafening Ruby. When she could focus again, she saw Floyd still standing, but Vaughn was down, clutching his shoulder. Not so quick after all, Floyd taunted, advancing on the wounded man. Any last words before I finish what I started with your family? Ruby's mind went blank with terror. Floyd was going to kill Vaughn, and it would be her fault for not finding a way to warn him adequately. Without conscious thought, she scrambled down from the loft, using the barn supports as a makeshift ladder, dropping the last few feet to the ground. The barn door stood open, framing the scene outside. Floyd stood over Vaughn, rifle aimed at his chest. In that moment, something broke free inside Ruby, a dam that had held back years of fear and rage and pain. No! The word tore from her throat, raw and hoarse from years of disuse, but unmistakably a human voice. No, Floyd! Both men turned in shock. Floyd's expression morphed from surprise to fury. You, he spat. You can talk? All this time, you've been playing me for a fool. He swung the rifle toward her, momentarily forgetting Vaughn. It was all the opening the wounded man needed. With a surge of desperate strength, Vaughn launched himself at Floyd's legs, tackling him to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as the two men grappled in the dirt. Ruby stood frozen, her own voice still echoing in her ears. She had spoken. After 3 years of silence, words had emerged from her throat. The realization was so overwhelming that, for a moment, she couldn't process the life or death struggle happening before her. A pained cry snapped her back to reality. Floyd had gained the upper hand, pinning Vaughn beneath him and pressing the rifle crosswise against his throat. Vaughn's face was contorted with effort as he fought to push the weapon away, but his wounded shoulder was clearly hampering him. Ruby's eyes darted around frantically, landing on a shovel leaning against the barn wall. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and rushed forward. "Get off him!" she screamed, her voice stronger now, fueled by adrenaline and righteous fury. She swung the shovel with all her might, connecting solidly with Floyd's back. He howled in pain, momentarily releasing his pressure on Vaughn's throat. It was enough. Vaughn heaved upward, throwing Floyd off balance. The rifle clattered to the ground between them. Both men lunged for the weapon. Vaughn reached it first, scrambling backward and bringing it to bear on Floyd, who froze mid-lunge. "It's over, Blackwell," Vaughn gasped, blood seeping through his shirt at the shoulder. "On your knees. Hands where I can see them." For a moment it seemed Floyd might comply. Then his eyes shifted to Ruby, standing wide-eyed with the shovel still clutched in her hands. "You ungrateful little—" He didn't finish the sentence, instead diving toward her with murderous intent. The rifle cracked once, the sound unnaturally loud in the clear night air. Floyd staggered, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he pressed a hand to his chest. Came away red with blood. He took one more stumbling step toward Ruby before collapsing face first onto the hard-packed earth. Silence descended, broken only by Vaughn's labored breathing as he kept the rifle trained on Floyd's motionless form. After a long moment, he lowered the weapon. "Ruby," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. "Are you all right?" She nodded, the shovel slipping from her nerveless fingers. Her throat felt strange, raw and open, as though something long buried had been unearthed. You spoke," Vaughn said, wonder mixing with the pain in his voice. "Yes." The word came out as a whisper, unfamiliar in her mouth after so long. "I spoke." Vaughn tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Ruby rushed to his side, supporting him as he sagged against her. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, like a creek thawing after a long winter. "Town's 5 miles, Vaughn murmured, his face alarmingly pale in the moonlight. "Not sure I can ride that far." Ruby helped him into the barn and eased him down onto a pile of clean straw. "Then I'll go for help." "No," he protested weakly. "Not safe. At night." "I can do it," she insisted, surprising herself with her newfound determination. "I found my voice tonight. I can find my way to town." Vaughn looked at her with something like awe despite his pain. "Ruby Matthews," he said softly. "I believe you can do anything you set your mind to." The ride to town was a blur of starlight and shadow. Ruby had never ridden alone before, but Vaughn's chestnut stallion seemed to sense the urgency of their mission, responding readily to her nervous guidance. The town doctor was roused from his bed, and within an hour, a wagon bearing the physician and Ruby was racing back to the Miller homestead. Vaughn's wound, though painful, proved less serious than feared. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major vessels. The doctor extracted fragments of shirt fabric from the wound, cleaned it thoroughly, and stitched it closed with neat, practiced movements. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Calloway," he pronounced as he packed away his instruments. "Another inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." As dawn broke, the local sheriff arrived to investigate the shooting. Ruby found herself giving a formal statement, her voice growing steadier with each recounting of the night's events. She told of Floyd's years of abuse, of his confession to the stagecoach robbery, of his attempt to murder Vaughn. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Parker who had known her father, listened with increasing dismay. "Should have checked on you more often, Miss Matthews," he said gruffly when she finished. "Your pa would be mighty disappointed in me for not seeing what was happening." "It wasn't your fault," Ruby assured him, finding forgiveness easier now that Floyd could no longer hurt her. "I hid it well. We all did what we thought we had to." The sheriff nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. "The territorial marshal will want statements from both of you. Blackwell was wanted in 2 states, though we didn't know he was hiding right under our noses as a respectable farmer." In the days that followed, Ruby found herself navigating a strange new reality. With Floyd dead and buried in an unmarked grave, the homestead where she'd been imprisoned for 3 years stood empty. The bank officially foreclosed on the property, but Vaughn arranged for Ruby to collect her personal belongings. Walking through the cabin one last time, Ruby felt oddly detached. The walls that had contained so much of her suffering seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. In her room, she retrieved her father's letters and the few mementos she possessed, packing them carefully in a small carpet bag that had been her mother's. As she prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway, looking back at the place that had been both home and prison. "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice clear in the empty space. Then she closed the door firmly behind her, walking toward the waiting wagon without a backward glance. Vaughn had made good on his promise about the Women's Aid Society in Cheyenne. Mrs. Henderson, a formidable widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Ruby with unexpected warmth. "Any friend of Vaughn Calloway's is welcome here," she declared, showing Ruby to a small but comfortable room in the spacious house that served as both home and shelter for women in need. "That young man saved my daughter from a most unsuitable marriage 2 years ago. We owe him a great debt." Ruby settled into a routine at the shelter, helping with cooking and cleaning while gradually growing more comfortable using her voice again. Mrs. Henderson proved to be not only a kind hostess but also a patient listener, sitting with Ruby in the evenings as she haltingly recounted her experiences. "The mind protects itself in strange ways," Mrs. Henderson observed one night as they sat knitting by the fire. "Your silence was a shield when you had no other defense." Ruby nodded, reflecting on the wisdom of those words. "I thought I'd forgotten how to speak," she admitted. "But when I saw Floyd about to kill Vaughn, the words just came back. Sometimes we find our voice when we need to speak for others rather than ourselves." Mrs. Henderson replied with a gentle smile. "It's often easier to be brave for someone else's sake." Vaughn visited regularly as his shoulder healed, bringing news from town and, occasionally, small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, fresh baked goods from the town's best bakery. Ruby found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. One crisp November afternoon, Vaughn invited her to walk with him through Cheyenne's modest Central Park. The last of the autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet as they strolled along the gravel paths, Ruby's arm tucked into the crook of Vaughn's good one. "The territorial marshal was impressed with your testimony," Vaughn told her. "Said your account helped close 3 open cases besides the stagecoach robbery." Ruby smiled, pleased that some good had come from her ordeal. "What will you do now?" she asked. "With your brother's killer brought to justice?" Vaughn was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I've been asking myself the same question. The bank has offered me a permanent position. But, Ruby prompted when he didn't continue. He guided her to a bench overlooking a small pond where a few hardy ducks still paddled despite the approaching winter. "But I'm not sure that's the life I want anymore." Ruby studied his profile, noting the way the afternoon sunlight caught in his dark hair, turning it almost mahogany where it curled above his collar. In the weeks since their harrowing night at the Miller homestead, she had come to know him better, his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his unexpected flashes of humor. He was unlike any man she had ever known. "What do you want?" she asked softly. Vaughn turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "I want something honest, something real. The war and then the search for my brother's killer. I've spent years focused on death and retribution. I'd like to build something now, instead of tearing down." "Like what?" "I've been looking at land south of here. Good grazing country. I thought, maybe a cattle ranch." He smiled slightly. "I worked cattle as a boy in Colorado. Always liked it." Ruby could easily imagine Vaughn on horseback, moving a herd across open grassland. It suited him far better than a banker's desk. "I think you'd make a fine rancher," she said sincerely. "Do you?" His smile widened. "I value your opinion on the matter." There was something in his tone that made Ruby's heart beat faster. She looked down at her gloved hands, suddenly shy. "My opinion doesn't count for much. I don't know the first thing about ranching." "But you know about courage," Vaughn said quietly. "About endurance. About finding strength when everything seems darkest." He reached over, gently tilting her chin up until she met his gaze. "You survived years of torment without breaking, Ruby. You saved my life at risk of your own. Your opinion counts for everything." Ruby felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever spoken to her with such respect, such admiration. "I've been offered a position as a schoolteacher in Denver," she confessed suddenly. Mrs. Henderson had connections with a school there and had suggested Ruby might be suited for the role, given her education and gentle manner with the children who sometimes stayed at the shelter. Vaughn's expression faltered slightly. "Denver? That's good. A fine opportunity." "Yes," Ruby agreed, watching him carefully. "But I haven't accepted yet." "Why not?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ruby gathered her courage. "Because I'm not sure that's the life I want anymore either." Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes, followed by a hope so naked it took her breath away. "What do you want, Ruby Matthews?" he asked, echoing her earlier question to him. "I want." She hesitated, years of forced silence making it difficult to articulate her deepest desires. "I want to never be afraid again. I want to use my voice. I want." Her courage almost failed her, but she pushed through. "I want to be with someone who makes me feel safe. Not because I need protection, but because I know they would never hurt me." Vaughn took her hands in his, holding them as if they were made of the finest porcelain. "Ruby," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have respected you from the first moment I saw you. I have admired your strength since I learned what you endured. And I have been falling in love with you since the night you found your voice to save my life." Ruby's eyes filled with tears, but for once, they were tears of joy rather than pain. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "There's so much I need to learn about being free." "Then learn with me," Vaughn urged gently. "Not as my wife, not yet unless and until you're certain, but perhaps as my partner. The ranch I'm considering has a small second cabin. You could have your own space, your own independence. We could build something together, see where it leads." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly attuned to what she needed, that Ruby could only stare at him in wonder. "You would do that? Wait for me to be ready." "Ruby," Vaughn said with absolute seriousness, "I would wait forever if there was even a chance you might someday share my feelings." "I already do," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Share your feelings, I just don't know if I can trust them yet or myself." Vaughn's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then we'll take all the time you need. The important thing is that you're free to choose now. Your life is your own." As winter settled over Wyoming territory, Ruby found herself embarking on a journey she had never imagined possible. With Mrs. Henderson's blessing, she moved to the small ranch Vaughn had purchased 15 miles south of Cheyenne. True to his word, he established her in the property's second cabin, a snug, one-room structure that he helped her make comfortable and secure. "Your own place," he said as he hung the sturdy door, complete with a lock that only she could control. "Your own rules." The symbolism of that door, of having control over who entered her space and when, was not lost on Ruby. For the first time since her father's death, she had a home that was truly hers, where no one could harm or threaten her. The ranch, which Vaughn named Calloway Creek after the small stream that bisected the property, gradually took shape around them. He purchased a small herd of cattle to start, built corrals and repaired fences, and hired 2 experienced cowhands who lived in the bunkhouse near the main ranch house. Ruby found unexpected joy in ranch life. She planted a vegetable garden beside her cabin, started a flock of chickens, and even learned to ride properly on a gentle mare Vaughn gifted her for Christmas. Her voice grew stronger daily, no longer rasping with disuse but taking on a melodic quality that sometimes surprised her when she spoke. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new growth, not just on the land but in Ruby herself. The nightmares that had plagued her became less frequent. She learned to laugh again, to enjoy simple pleasures like wading in the creek or singing to herself as she worked. Her relationship with Vaughn evolved gradually, naturally. They ate dinner together most evenings, sometimes in his house, sometimes in hers. They read to each other by lamplight poetry, novels, newspapers from back east. On Sundays, they rode to church together in Vaughn's wagon, presenting a picture of propriety that nonetheless set tongues wagging about the unusual living arrangement. "People will talk," Ruby observed one Sunday as they drove home, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. "Let them," Vaughn replied with an easy shrug. "We know the truth of things." The truth was that their relationship remained chaste, though not for lack of growing feelings. Vaughn never pressed for more than Ruby was ready to give, maintaining a respectful distance that nevertheless seemed to diminish with each passing week. A touch of hands while passing a dish at dinner, the brush of shoulders as they walked side by side, his hand at the small of her back as he helped her into the wagon. Small touches, innocent in themselves, that nonetheless kindled a warmth in Ruby she had never experienced before, a warmth that was desire rather than fear. By late summer, the ranch was flourishing. The cattle were fat on the rich prairie grass, the vegetable garden yielded more than Ruby could preserve, and the sound of hammers rang out as Vaughn and his men built a proper barn to replace the rickety structure that had come with the property. One golden August evening, Ruby sat on the porch of her cabin, shelling peas into a bowl and watching as Vaughn worked shirtless in the heat, helping to raise the barn's frame. The play of muscles across his back and shoulders fascinated her, as did the easy camaraderie he shared with his workers. Here was a man who led by example, who never asked others to do what he wouldn't do himself. When the day's work was done, Vaughn dismissed the hands and walked toward Ruby's cabin, pausing at the water pump to sluice dust and sweat from his upper body. Ruby found herself unable to look away as water ran in rivulets down his chest, catching the last rays of the setting sun. He pulled his shirt back on before approaching her porch, as he always did, a small courtesy that spoke volumes about his respect for her sensibilities. "Looks like a fine crop of peas," he observed, settling onto the step below her, his damp hair curling at the nape of his neck. "Enough to last through winter," Ruby agreed, resuming her shelling. "The barn's coming along well. Should be finished before the first snow." Vaughn leaned back against the porch post, regarding her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "You look beautiful tonight, Ruby." She blushed, still unaccustomed to compliments despite his frequent offerings of them. "I'm sweaty and covered in garden dirt." "Yes," he agreed with a grin. "Beautiful." Ruby laughed, tossing an empty pea pod at him. He caught it deftly, his smile widening. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence. "Harvest festival's coming up next month in town. There'll be dancing." Ruby's hands stilled. "Dancing? Vaughn twirled the pea pod between his fingers. "Thought you might like to go. With me. As my, well, not as my neighbor or friend. As my sweetheart, I suppose you'd call it." Ruby's heart fluttered. Though everyone in the county assumed they were courting, neither had put a name to their relationship until now. "Your sweetheart," she repeated, testing the word. "If you'd like to be," Vaughn said, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time in their acquaintance. "I don't want to presume." "Yes," Ruby interrupted, her voice clear and confident. "I'd like that very much." The smile that spread across Vaughn's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Well, then," he said, standing and extending his hand to her. "Miss Matthews, may I have the honor of escorting you to the Harvest Festival?" Ruby placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work, the strength that had never been used against her, only for her. "The honor would be mine, Mr. Calloway." The Harvest Festival transformed Cheyenne's main street into a riot of color and sound. Bunting and lanterns hung from every available surface. Fiddle music spilled from the dance platform erected in the town square, and the aroma of roasting meat and baked goods filled the air. Ruby, dressed in a new calico gown of deep blue that Vaughn had insisted on purchasing for her, felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as they arrived. It was her first large social gathering since finding her freedom, and she wasn't entirely sure how to navigate it. "Nervous?" Vaughn asked softly as he handed her down from the wagon, looking handsome in a clean white shirt and dark vest. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I've been to a dance." "We'll stay as long as you're comfortable," he promised. "Just say the word when you've had enough." His consideration warmed her heart. "Thank you." As they moved through the crowd, Ruby was surprised by how many people greeted her by name, treating her not with the pity she had feared but with genuine warmth. Word of her ordeal had spread. Of course, it was impossible to keep secrets in a small community, but rather than becoming a source of shame, it seemed to have earned her a measure of respect. "Brave girl," she overheard one older woman murmur to another as they passed. "Always knew Jonathan Matthews' daughter had spirit." The dancing began as twilight deepened into night. Vaughn led Ruby onto the platform for a lively reel, his hands steady at her waist as they moved through the steps. At first, she concentrated fiercely on remembering the patterns, but gradually, the music seeped into her bones, and she found herself laughing as Vaughn swung her through a turn. "You're a natural," he told her as the dance ended, his eyes crinkling at the corners with pleasure. Or I have an excellent partner, she countered, flushed with exertion and happiness. They danced until Ruby's feet ached pleasantly in her new shoes, pausing occasionally for refreshments or to chat with neighbors. As the evening wore on, the music slowed, and couples drew closer together on the dance floor. Vaughn's hand at her waist felt different now, more intimate somehow, though its pressure remained as light and respectful as ever. Ruby found herself moving closer to him of her own accord, her hand sliding from his shoulder to the nape of his neck where his hair curled against her fingers. "Ruby," he murmured, his voice husky in a way that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Yes?" she whispered, looking up into eyes that had darkened to the color of storm clouds. Before he could respond, the music ended, and the mayor stepped onto the platform to announce the final dance of the evening. Couples rearranged themselves, breaking the moment of intimacy that had bloomed between them. As they took their positions for the last waltz, Vaughn's expression was different, more resolved, as though he had come to some decision. "Ruby," he began again as they moved slowly across the platform. "I've been patient, I hope, given you time and space." "You have," she assured him, wondering where this was leading. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, his gaze never leaving hers despite the other couples swirling around them. "With the intention of marriage, if you'll have me." Ruby's breath caught. Though not unexpected, the declaration still sent her heart racing. "Vaughn, not right away," he added quickly. "I know you're still finding your way. But I love you, Ruby Matthews. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the woman you're becoming now that you're free to be yourself. And I want to build a life with you as equals, as partners, as husband and wife someday." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easily now. "I think I have since you told me I was safe with you and then proved it with every action since." Vaughn's arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer as they continued to waltz. "Does that mean yes? You'll let me court you?" Ruby laughed softly. "Vaughn Calloway, I believe you've been courting me since the day we moved to the ranch. But yes, make it official if you like." The music swelled around them as Vaughn bent his head, his lips finding hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely a whisper of contact. Yet that whisper sparked something deep within Ruby, a hunger, a need, a certainty that this man was meant to be hers in every way. When they broke apart, the dance had ended, but neither noticed until the applause of the crowd brought them back to awareness of their surroundings. Ruby blushed deeply, realizing they had just shared their first kiss in front of half the county. Vaughn merely smiled, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm with quiet pride as they left the platform. "Let them talk," he murmured, echoing his words from months before. "We know the truth of things." The drive home under a canopy of stars felt different, charged with possibility and unspoken promises. When they reached the ranch, Vaughn walked Ruby to her cabin door as he always did. But tonight, instead of bidding her good night with a respectful nod, he gathered her gently into his arms. "May I kiss you again?" he asked, his voice rough with restraint. "Properly this time, without an audience?" In answer, Ruby rose on tiptoe, her arms twining around his neck as she pressed her lips to his. This kiss was deeper, more certain, a true meeting of souls who had found each other against all odds. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "before I forget myself entirely." Ruby nodded, though part of her wished he would stay. "Good night, Vaughn. Good night, my love." He pressed one more chaste kiss to her forehead before stepping back. "Sleep well." As autumn painted the prairie in russet and gold, Ruby and Vaughn's courtship blossomed in full view of the community. They attended church together, visited friends as a couple, and welcomed neighbors to Sunday dinners at the ranch. Ruby continued to maintain her separate cabin, but increasingly found herself spending her days in Vaughn's larger home, making it more comfortable with feminine touches, curtains at the windows, braided rugs on the floors, wildflowers in simple vases. One crisp October day, almost exactly a year since the night Floyd Blackwell had met his end, Vaughn suggested a picnic by the creek that gave the ranch its name. Ruby packed a basket with fried chicken, fresh bread, and an apple pie she'd baked that morning, while Vaughn saddled their horses. The spot he chose was particularly lovely, a small meadow where late-blooming wildflowers still dotted the grass and cottonwoods rustled overhead, their leaves a brilliant yellow against the clear blue sky. They spread a blanket beneath the largest tree and enjoyed their meal, talking easily about ranch business, plans for winter, news from town. After they'd eaten, Vaughn stretched out on the blanket, his head pillowed in Ruby's lap as she leaned against the tree trunk. She stroked his hair absently, marveling at how comfortable they had become with each other, how natural this intimacy felt. "I've been thinking," Vaughn said after a companionable silence, gazing up at her with clear gray eyes, "about the future." "Oh," Ruby smiled down at him. "What about it?" He sat up, turning to face her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "About our future, specifically. Together." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Ruby's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Ruby Matthews," Vaughn said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "This past year has been the happiest of my life, despite how it began. You've shown me what true courage looks like. You've helped me find purpose beyond vengeance. You've made this piece of prairie into a home." He took her hand, his thumb caressing her palm. "I love you more than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, my heart's companion for all our days." Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her. Then her voice returned, as it always did when she needed it most. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, Vaughn, I will marry you." His answering smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the autumn sunlight like a promise made tangible. "It was my mother's," he explained as Ruby admired it. "She always said it should go to the woman who captured my heart completely." "It's beautiful," Ruby whispered, overwhelmed by the significance of receiving such a family heirloom. "I'll treasure it always." Vaughn gathered her into his arms, his kiss tender yet passionate, a preview of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "When?" he asked simply. Ruby considered. Traditional courtships often lasted years, but theirs had been anything but traditional. And after all they had endured, waiting seemed unnecessary. "Christmas?" she suggested. "A Christmas wedding here at the ranch." Vaughn's eyes lit up. "Perfect. Just enough time to prepare, but not so long that I'll go mad with waiting." Ruby laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "You're very impatient, Mr. Calloway. Only when it comes to making you officially mine, Miss Matthews," he replied with a grin. "I've been perfectly patient until now." "That you have," she agreed, running her fingers through his hair. "And I love you all the more for it." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Ruby, with Mrs. Henderson's help, sewed a wedding dress of ivory satin with lace trim. Vaughn, meanwhile, worked with his hands to build new furniture for their home, a larger bed, a rocking chair for the porch, a writing desk where Ruby could continue the journal she had begun keeping since finding her voice again. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white a week before Christmas. The snow lent a fairy-tale quality to the landscape that seemed perfectly suited to the occasion. On Christmas Eve morning, Ruby awoke in her cabin for the last time as an unmarried woman, her heart full of anticipation. Mrs. Henderson arrived early to help her prepare, bringing with her a gift of family Bible that had belonged to Ruby's parents. "Your father left it with me for safekeeping," she explained as Ruby traced the embossed leather cover with wondering fingers. "He asked that I give it to you when you married. He always believed you would find happiness, dear girl, even when things were at their darkest." Tears filled Ruby's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging the older woman tightly, "for everything, for helping me find my way back to myself." "You did that yourself," Mrs. Henderson corrected gently. "Now, let's get you ready to meet your groom." The ceremony was simple but profound. Garlands of evergreen and red berries decorated the ranch house, and candles glowed warmly in every window. The local minister officiated, and the guests' neighbors, friends, and the ranch hands gathered in the main room where the furniture had been pushed back to create space. Vaughn waited by the hearth, his tall frame resplendent in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving the doorway where Ruby would appear. When she did, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. Her ivory gown caught the firelight, lending her skin a golden glow. Her auburn hair was arranged in loose curls, adorned with a crown of holly berries and winter greenery. But it was her face that truly captivated, radiant with happiness, free of the shadows that had once haunted her eyes. As Ruby walked toward him, Vaughn's expression was one of such undisguised adoration that several of the ladies present dabbed at their eyes. When she reached his side, he took her hands in his, squeezing them gently as if to reassure himself that she was real. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over them, sacred and timeless. When it came time for their vows, Vaughn spoke first, his voice clear and unwavering. "Ruby, when I first met you, you couldn't speak, but your eyes told me everything I needed to know about your courage and your heart. I vow to listen not just to your words but to what lies beneath them. I vow to be your shelter when you need protection and your freedom when you need space. I vow to love you completely, honestly, and faithfully for all the days of my life." Ruby, who had feared she might lose her voice in this moment of heightened emotion, found instead that it rang out strong and true. "Vaughn, you saw me when I was invisible. You waited patiently while I found my way back to myself. You showed me that safety isn't about walls and locks but about trust and respect. I vow to stand beside you as your equal partner in all things. I vow to face whatever comes with the same courage you've taught me to recognize in myself. And I vow to love you with everything I am, everything I have been, and everything I will become, for as long as we both shall live." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as they exchanged rings, a simple gold band joining the pearl on Ruby's finger, a matching one for Vaughn. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn gathered Ruby into his arms with reverent joy, his kiss a promise sealed before witnesses but meant for her alone. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing, feasting and laughter. As midnight approached, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their home at last. Vaughn closed the door behind the final well-wishers, then turned to find Ruby standing by the hearth, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. The sight of her, his wife, made his breath catch. "Mrs. Calloway," he said softly, crossing to her side. "How do you like the sound of that?" Ruby smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting both certainty and a touch of nervous anticipation. "It sounds like belonging," she replied honestly. "Like home." Vaughn's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "You are my home, Ruby, wherever you are." Their kiss deepened, no longer constrained by the propriety they had maintained throughout their courtship. Vaughn's hands trembled slightly as they traced the line of her back, the curve of her waist, while Ruby's fingers tangled in his hair, holding him to her as though afraid he might disappear. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I want this night to be perfect for you," he murmured. "We can go as slowly as you need." Ruby's heart swelled with love for this man who continued to put her needs first, even now. "I'm not afraid," she told him truthfully. "Not with you. Never with you." Taking his hand, she led him toward their bedroom, no longer his alone but theirs to share. As they crossed the threshold, Ruby left behind the last vestiges of the silent, frightened girl she had once been. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed her voice, her strength, and her capacity for joy. In the sanctuary of their marriage bed, Ruby and Vaughn discovered each other fully at last, their bodies speaking a language as ancient and true as the love that had brought them together. Where once there had been pain and fear in physical touch, Ruby found only pleasure and completion in her husband's embrace. And Vaughn, who had carried his own burdens of grief and vengeance for so long, found healing in the gift of Ruby's trust. As they lay entwined in the quiet aftermath, watching snow fall gently beyond the window, Ruby traced the scar on Vaughn's shoulder, the wound that had brought them to this moment. "I used to dream of escape," she confessed softly. "During those years with Floyd, I imagined running away, finding some place where no one knew me, where I could start over. But I never could have imagined this, finding not just freedom but love." Vaughn kissed her temple, his arms tightening around her. "Sometimes the things we can't imagine are exactly what we need." "Yes," Ruby agreed, resting her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "And sometimes the darkest paths lead to the brightest futures." Spring came early to Calloway Creek Ranch in 1875. As the prairie awakened with new growth, so too did the ranch flourish under the care of its devoted owners. The cattle herd had grown, the barn was filled with healthy horses, and the garden beside what was now called the little cabin yielded its first tender shoots of the season. Ruby stood on the porch of the main house, one hand resting lightly on her swelling abdomen as she watched Vaughn and the hands moving cattle to the upper pasture. For months into her pregnancy, she glowed with the particular radiance of a woman who had found her place in the world. The little cabin that had once been her solitary refuge now served as a schoolhouse one day a week, where Ruby taught reading and writing to the children of neighboring ranches. The other days, she managed the household accounts, corresponded with cattle buyers, and continued writing in her journal, which had expanded to include stories she hoped to someday publish. As Vaughn rode into the yard, dust-covered but smiling, Ruby felt the now familiar flutter of the child moving within her. A son or daughter who would grow up knowing only love and safety, who would learn about the darker parts of their parents' past only when old enough to understand the triumph that had emerged from tragedy. Vaughn dismounted, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps to kiss his wife. "How are my treasures today?" he asked, his hand joining hers over their unborn child. "We are perfect," Ruby replied, her voice strong and clear in the spring sunshine. "Absolutely perfect." And in that moment, as in all the moments they would share through the years to come, Ruby knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found not just safety but something far more precious, a love that had given her back her voice, her freedom, and herself.